And our next speaker will be Ken Kirkey, the Planning Director of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for coming to the Metro Center. And I really do appreciate the work that the League does. It's genuinely nice to see so many people in this room and such a civil conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, just a little bit about Plan Bay Area, the Bay Area's Regional Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy that was adopted in 2013, and a little bit more about some of the things we're doing to implement the plan that tie into greenhouse gas reductions. This slide, which is unfortunately fairly hard to read, this is about one aspect of the plan that didn't actually get so much attention, but from my perspective was probably one of the best aspects of the plan. It was a project performance assessment we did for transportation projects that were submitted for the RTP. It's a very different take than we had done in the past. It was a very deliberate attempt to connect regional transportation planning with the requirements of SB 375 and to look at some broader regional goals. So what we did was come up with goals that were adopted by the policymakers at MTC and ABAG related to the economy, the environment, and equity, as well as a cost-benefit analysis for each of the projects. We put those through this assessment and we came up with a project list that was really quite different than the project lists in terms of priorities and ranking than we had ever seen before in the Regional Transportation Plan. This again, I'm sorry that it's hard to read, but I'll focus on the project that is in the upper right of this slide. It's called BART Metro. It's the highest performing project in the plan. BART Metro is essentially providing more capacity to the core of the system. Any of you who are on the trains at commute times, particularly going in and out of San Francisco during the week, know that we're packed like sardines these days. And to address that in the near term, as well as the longer term, requires a lot of investment, requires things like a train control system being replaced, additional cars, more capacity in the downtown stations. It also ties very closely to the growth in the plan. So there's a lot of job and housing growth in the plan in the core of San Francisco, in downtown Oakland, around the BART stations, throughout the network, and this investment ties back to that growth pattern. So it's an example of something we did different, and I think it's better than what we've done in the past, and it does tie to greenhouse gas emissions. Another program that we started just prior to the plan kickoff is something called the One Bay Area Grant Program. MTC had a whole series of programs in the past, a bike and ped program, a larger local streets and roads program. They were separate silos of money that went out to various entities. This program wrapped them into one, essentially a block grant that goes out to the counties, the congestion management agencies, the transportation agencies for the counties. And it's based upon a formula that combines housing, housing production, the housing communities in those counties have to plan for through the very popular regional housing need allocation process. It also required that in our 5 more urban counties that 70% of the funding needed to be invested in what are called priority development areas. Those are transit-served infill areas that are nominated by local jurisdictions. There was another set of requirements that any jurisdiction receiving any of these funds, whether or not it would be spent in a priority development area or not, had to have a certified housing element. Many of you are probably aware that in the Bay Area, although housing elements are a requirement as part of the general plan process, they're supposed to be updated every several years. We've had a number of jurisdictions in the past in the Bay Area just didn't feel like doing that. It turns out that this seems to have had an effect because for the first time since RENA was started, every jurisdiction in the Bay Area currently has a certified housing element. And I guess we'd like to think there's a connection. There's also complete street requirements. And I think part of the reason we were able to move this forward, because it is fairly groundbreaking compared to what happens in much of the country, was that there was still flexibility at the local level. And I think it's working pretty well. This is the distribution formula that I mentioned. You can see that the larger, more urban counties taking on more growth get more of the money. One of the programs we've had for some time that doesn't get so much attention, but we think it's really important, is the Priority Development Area Planning Program. It's essentially a neighborhood planning program. We make money available to local communities to plan neighborhoods. We are in one of those areas right now, the Lake Merritt Station area. Plan was recently adopted. There's been a couple year-long process working with people in this neighborhood about what do they want this neighborhood to be over time. How can it take on more growth and still be a place that benefits the folks who've lived here for a long time. And over 60,000 homes have been planned through this process. So it's a critical part of implementing focused growth here in the Bay Area. After our policymakers endured a fairly long discussion the night of the adoption of the plan, to their credit, I think they got down to work on one of the key issues related to the plan, and it does get back to what I touched on earlier, and that's transit capacity. There's enough money in the plan to maintain the current levels of service. There was not enough money in the plan to really expand capacity, expand service going forward. And given the growth in the plan and that we project greater transit ridership, it was seen as something that needed to be dealt with. One of the things we've embarked on right now in partnership with AC Transit, BART, San Francisco Muni essentially, and the ferries, as well as Caltrain, which Caltrain needs to be added to the slide, is looking at the core of the region. It sort of builds on the BART Metro idea I talked about, and looking near term, what are some near term solutions, and really looking at these transit operators as if we were actually a system. How can they work together? How can the system work together to provide more capacity? In the midterm, what are some additional investments that can be made for more capacity? And then in the long term, when all that is done, given the level of growth that we expect, say at 2040, 2030, somewhere along the line, when might we need to consider things like a second Transbay tube for BART, which is getting a lot of mention in the press right now, but it's actually probably the furthest out of all the things we'll be looking at. The South Bay is also taking on a lot of growth in the plan, particularly around San Jose. South Bay is in a very different place at this point in time in terms of its land use pattern, its urbanizing. BART is being extended to San Jose, Caltrain's being electrified, but it's still a much more suburban region. And as these systems get put into place, one of the things we want to do is ensure that people use the systems. So working with BTA, we're developing a series of solutions that we hope will be helpful for the first and last mile connections, which in the South Bay are huge. It's the the region that invented the office park, and getting people from the office park to the station and the reverse is really important. So this study will look at that, and we hope that there'll be some tools that can be used across the region that come out of it. Building on work that's happened in the city of San Francisco as well as with BART, we're doing a study looking at the underutilized public lands near the transit stations and along the corridors, not just transit-owned lands, but just public lands that are not being well utilized. Might they be places where additional mixed income development could happen? Is there a way to incentivize affordable housing given the lack of funding at the state level for affordable housing? I heard a question earlier on for the lead speaker on parking. We're doing a study, a project on parking at this point in time, working with a number of communities in the region. This is a pricing strategy that, in my experience, tends to make people yawn very quickly. Parking is not that exciting until you can't find a spot and you're angry. But nonetheless, we know that in some communities where they've implemented parking policies, they've worked quite well. Berkeley actually has been very successful in terms of setting up parking strategies for downtown Berkeley that have lessened the amount of driving people need to do. They've removed some of the burden on developers to provide parking because of shared parking, and we hope this project will be helpful in that regard. I'm going to very quickly, because I have a minute, go through the next few slides. One is related to a partnership with the Air Quality Management District. A commuter benefits ordinance was enacted this past year. It requires employers of more than 50 employees to provide a commuter benefit to their employees. It's really the first in the nation like this, and we hope it'll have a big impact. There's a whole series of innovative grants that we've provided for climate initiative programs, from Safe Routes to School the clean vehicles. John was talking about the EV charger network. We're working with the Air District to implement that. We're putting money into van pools that serve communities of concern, and we recognize that not everybody in the region works for Google. And that car sharing is something that should be expanded, and so we've just recently given grants to expand car sharing, for example, to the Coliseum station area here in Oakland, to the Fruitvale station area, to a number of other communities of concern. And with that, I'll say thank you.